Hey there, I'm Linus from Gravitee. Today we'll be looking at Gravitee provider and consumer concepts. So a provider is someone that wants to expose a service, an API, to a developer, a partner, a customer, and a consumer is the other entity that needs to discover, understand, and ultimately access and interact with those API services. So if you're an API provider that needs to expose this data, typically you will have something like an HTTP service, or you might be having something like Kafka or Solace, so maybe some streaming technology as well that you need your users to interact with. And in Gravitee, you have the concept of an API. So an API is effectively the proxy on top of those services that your consumers will be interacting with. So in Gravitee, to have a consumer getting access and authenticating to the API, you need to have what is called a plan. So a plan, or effectively can be multiple plans with different authentication types. So maybe I'm going to have a gold plan over here that is for my paying members, and then maybe I'm going to have a silver plan for maybe a lower tier customer. And my gold plan, maybe that one will be using something like JWT authentication, and maybe my silver plan will be using something like API key. And maybe I'm going to decide that for my silver plan, maybe I'm also going to enforce some sort of rate limiting potentially. So an API is associated with those different plans. Now, if you look on the consumer side, typically what people do is that either they use the concept of an application to determine what is the end entity that is consuming and subscribing to these APIs. Could be a mobile application, could be a partner, a customer, could be something that people are creating themselves, or it could be managed by the provider themselves potentially. Now, an application have a couple of different things. First of all, it has a couple of members associated with it. So a member is effectively someone that have access in some way to use this application to subscribe, view the analytics and logging of the actual API that it is using. So how does an application get access to an API? Well, that is through what we call a subscription. So a subscription is effectively the way for the application to be approved and allowed to access the API through a particular plan. So one application might have multiple subscriptions, but one subscription can only subscribe to one plan at a time. So ultimately what we have here now is we have the API service or streaming capability. It's exposed through a Gravitee API concept created with different plans, and ultimately that is what the consumer is using an application for to subscribe to those different plans. Now obviously you can have tons of different concepts that helps with this. In the API console, an API provider might be able to do things like set up different policies. Rate limiting being one of them, maybe XML to JSON transformations to give another sort of consumer experience, maybe some threat protection capability. They also have things like API scoring capabilities, so providers can set different rules for how a good quality API should be delivered to a consumer. You have obviously different permissions to control how your consumers are able to access your APIs in terms of group assignment, and if they can read, subscribe, view analytics and that sort of stuff. And of course, you also have customizable approval flows. Maybe in some cases you want your customers to self-service these approval flows to get access immediately, or you maybe have a complex approval flow that includes integrations with ServiceNow or other systems like that. And then typically you have a developer portal. So either the API provider manages the entire lifecycle of how people are accessing the APIs, or you have a self-service capability for the consumer, typically through a developer portal where they can see things like documentation. Typically this will be branded so that it maps the identity of the provider organization. There might be things like categories that the APIs are grouped into. You typically have things like sign up and registration processes potentially. Maybe there's some SSO with GitHub or Google or an enterprise identity provider for the users to sign in, but you also very often have documentation and maybe even capabilities for users to try out the API immediately in the developer portal before they go through the subscription mechanism. And you also have more like of a community sort of engagement with your consumers in terms of maybe raising tickets or rating the API so that other developers have some feedback on how that works. So that's kind of the Gravitee provider and consumer concepts. Thanks for watching.